Thank you, Minister Lyons, for that introduction. It was terrific. Thank you all for coming here today. And before we start, I would like to thank PRONI and also the Northern Ireland War Memorial, who without their input, this project wouldn't have actually got off the ground. And more recently, on a one-to-one, I would like to thank Keith Beattie, who has practically been my PA for the last month. We've been in touch on almost a daily basis. But we're here now, and it's the second event today, so the longest day, quite apt. So I'm going to talk about this project, which has led to publication of the book, We Fought on D-Day. A couple of years ago, it was actually during COVID, during lockdown, Brian Henry Martin, who had worked with before in DoubleBand Films, he offered up to me very kindly. I don't know why he did it. I have no idea. But he, of all the people in all the world, he offered me the material, the unused material from his film, which was made 20 years ago. The film was made with 8 veterans. And of course, now they've all passed away. If you think about it, that 20 years ago was 60 years on from the D-Day landings, and they were men in age 19 and in their 20s then. So unfortunately, now they've all passed. So this is my book. It's available here today. On the front cover, you'll see a young rifleman who I'll talk about shortly, and also the church tower and church and Commonwealth War Graves Cemetery at Ronville Cemetery in France, which also features in relation to one of these veterans in particular. Actually, the guy on the left here, Bill McConnell. We also will talk about Sam Lowry. They were both 1st Battalion Airborne. By airborne, we mean that they landed using gliders as opposed to parachutes. And as one of them actually pointed out, they didn't actually land, they crashed, and that was the plan. They had to crash. So they crashed into France, close to what we know today as Pegasus Bridge, which was actually the Bonneville Bridge. Also Hammy Lawrence on the left, and on the right, Jimmy Bowden. Jimmy actually did parachute in. Out of the 8 men, he was the first to go in. He had a specific job. He had to clear what was known as Rommel's asparagus, which were telegraph poles, and they were fitted with teller mines, so that should an airborne landing be attempted, these defences would actually destroy anything that tried to land on any potential fields that were there. Jimmy landed, he parachuted out, and the first thing he had to do was get rid of his bicycle. Everyone here had bicycles, believe it or not, and Bran mentioned this earlier at the talk at the City Hall. And the idea was that they would all land and get on their bicycles and cycle into Caen and take the city. That didn't happen. It wasn't going to happen. Jimmy chucked his bicycle out of the airplane that he was in, and as he was doing so, they got the light to jump. He was actually helping his captain throw his bicycle out, and they got the warning light to jump. And at that stage, Jimmy was holding on to the captain, and the captain just went, and Jimmy was dragged out after him. So he had no choice. He was going, and his bike was lost, which was, I think, a relief to him. And unfortunately, as was all his other kit, the kit was to be suspended on a rope with a little clasp from his belt, and it would land just ahead of him as he hit the ground. The rope snapped, and the kit was lost. So Jimmy arrived in France with nothing but a fighting knife with his, and no other kit. So he ended up, he found some and proceeded on and carried out his mission. A couple of other guys in, Marty Vance and Robert Loughlin, Richard Keegan, and Stanley Burrows, with representatives here of Burrows, Keegan, Vance and McConnell families all here today, I'm pleased to say. And they'll be available, I think, I hope, for you to have a chat with later. Stanley Burrows, as I say, I was given this material by Brian Henry Martin, and the first thing that went through my mind was, oh dear, because I didn't want to just replicate his documentary. I didn't want to plagiarise his work and produce what was effectively a transcript of what had already been a film documentary. So I started to then look at little comments that these guys would make that weren't particularly useful in the context of a documentary. And they're little throwaway words, sayings, one or two little sentences here and there. So I picked up on those and started to look into them. And there's one that Stanley came out with. I've already recounted this story at the City Hall. For those of you that were there here now, you can switch off for a minute or two, but not too long. And Stanley made a comment, quite rightly, stating that of the 2nd Battalion of the Ulster Rifles who landed on Sword Beach, there were no fatalities. And that is amazing. You know, when you see the film Saving Private Ryan on Omaha Beach and all that went on. Bear in mind, they were second wave, but even at that, there were no fatalities. The whole battalion landed on the beach and they all got off the beach and moved their way inland. There were about a dozen or so casualties through mortar fire and sniper fire. When I started to look at the records then, I found that there was one man recorded on the Commonwealth War Graves website as killed in action. He was actually recorded as missing in action on the 6th of June. So Stanley had stated no one was killed, but he also made that little comment, and he said he had been approached by people over the years and someone had said there'd been fatalities at sea, and he emphasised no one was killed at sea. The whole battalion landed on Sword Beach and they all got off the beach. And that was quite right. But that, if you can imagine, is just his consciousness of what he knew. He was on Sword Beach, he knew he was there, and he knew everyone got off it. But what Stanley didn't know, that there was a detachment of 12 men, 12 Ulster Riflemen, who were part of a larger detachment of about 550 soldiers from various regiments. And what their job was, they had lorries, and these lorries were loaded with ammunition, food, spurs, fuel, whatever. And the idea was that they would land on the 7th of June and drive inland and resupply their battalions. So these 12 Ulster Riflemen, along with everyone else, they embarked on the 7th of June from Southend-on-Sea. Now, when I looked at the name of the guy who was killed on the 6th of June, he's a lad called Jim Whitehorn, and that's the photograph on the front cover of the book. He's from Stepney in East London. And through the years, I've looked at the war diaries and the regimental history, and I've actually found that for a number of years, quite a number of years, he had 2 death dates. One was the 6th of June and one was the 12th of June. So, you know, you can lie about your age, you can lie about your birthday, but you can't often lie about your death. So what has happened? So I started to then look at the records that are in the Royal Ulster Rifles Museum. They give me access, a terrific level of access, and I found 5 pages, and they belong to a captain who was in charge of the headquarters company called Ryan. And so he had these 5 pages of basically names, numbers, and their role. So we've got a service number, Corporal Newman, he was company headquarters clerk actually. And then you have a number here beside it, 392, 392, D17, etc. And you can see young Whitehorn here. He's actually the last on the list, probably because it was alphabetical. But he's an MT fitter, and the number here is 3211. Another lad up here, 3211, and you can see that he is a driver with a 3-ton truck with small arms ammunition, SAA. So I was intrigued by these numbers, this list of numbers. Every man on the 6 pages had one, and some were duplicated. And then I realised that I think it was one of these, maybe not on this list, but there was another number, and I'd actually seen it painted on the side of a landing craft, in a photograph of a landing craft that was used on D-Day. So I started to think that this was an embarkation list, and all the people on this list, these were the ships or landing craft that they were to go to. So I started to look at the number 3211, and I found Now, bear in mind, all of this research can be done now. 20 years ago, I mean, Brian gave me his research, and it was a large chest, is the only word I can use to describe it, and it's all books and maps and written records. Whereas today, we've got the internet, and we've got places like here at PRONI, and material like this is available and searchable online. So that's what I did. And I found out that 3211 was a code serial number for a ship called the SS Sambut. And the SS Sambut was part of a convoy of 12 ships called Landing Force L. And it was their job, as I said, to land on the 7th of June, and the whole of the Landing Force L would have deployed onto Normandy and been a resupply. There were about 560 men on board, including crew, and the 12 Ulster Riflemen, including Jim Whitehorn. Now, the ship sailed from Southend-on-Sea at 6 a.m. on the 6th of June, and as it passed by the cliffs of Dover, it was flying a barrage balloon. One of the Royal Navy O'Connell, whose daughter is with us today, he landed, young lad. He had lied about his age to join the battalion. He later became the regimental sergeant major. So they basically got their heads down in around Ronville on the first night of D-Day. They landed about 9 p.m. As dawn broke, they started to get their act together and started to move through the village. And Jimmy Bowden, the other paratrooper that I'd mentioned earlier, he was doing the same thing on the far side of the river. And as he got himself up, he noticed that the ground around him was starting to flick up into the air, and he was actually coming under sniper fire from the church tower here. And you can see the tower, it's not like we have here, it's a separate building on it in its own, detached from the church. And the Commonwealth War Grave Cemetery is what's there today. Back in the day, there would have been a little cemetery, church cemetery behind this wall, which goes right round the building. So as Bill McConnell and the 1st Battalion started to move out, they became also under sniper fire. The commander called Bill up. He was a trained sniper, so it was his job to take out his counterpart in the tower, which he did. And the story came about when Brian was making the film, and they filmed Bill, I think, at the Airborne Cross, which is just off screen here to the left, and he laid a wreath, and they filmed that. And I think you can see that scene when you watch the film. We fought on D-Day. It's on iPlayer because it was broadcast again just on Sunday night past on BBC Two. They did the filming, and they were packing up and getting all their equipment put away, and Bill McConnell wandered off through the little gap here and round behind the church. And the film guys were going, "What's happening here?" Brian watched from afar and saw Bill lay another wreath at a grave. And Brian described to me that it took him a long time to actually break down these guys, to build confidence and get them to talk about their experiences. But over a period of time, Brian, he didn't film anything then, but over a period of time, he actually built up the confidence to ask Bill what this was about. And Bill told him that he was laying the wreath at the grave of the German soldier who he had killed. And he continued to return there until the year he died. So you can see that there was a mutual respect there between Bill and his counterpart. And perhaps Bill put himself in his position, and here was this guy in a church tower, holding off an invasion, but there was only going to be one result there sooner or later. So, but that's the grave of, he's actually an unknown German sniper who they recovered from the tower and buried at the church cemetery. So on the other side, back to this map, So all that happened around about here. And then on the other side of things, the 2nd Battalion made their way from Sword Beach. They stayed overnight here, Perrier-sur-le-Dam, and they moved just this side of a little village called Annecy. And the idea was then that they would put in an attack at Common Plain. They couldn't carry out a good reconnaissance because there were wide, flat fields filled neck high with corn on the approach to the village. And this is the view from where I just showed you on the map, really. This was the start line, effectively, of their attack on the 7th of June. The commander directed that one company carry out the attack. They, as I say, they couldn't really do an effective reconnaissance. At the edge of these fields then, where you see the tree line in the distance, there was a railway track, a ditch, and then a 10-foot wall. And they didn't know what was behind the wall. So they put the attack in anyway, and it was repulsed. And Stanley Burrows and Dickie Keegan, they recall the story. And once they got, there was a hole in the wall. And again, if you watch the film, there's a classic line in it. And one of the guys is describing, "Come into my parlour," said the spider to the fly. There was one hole in the wall, whether it was put there on purpose or whether it had appeared, you know, by shell fire, general shell fire, but it was the only way in. So the guys went in, and of course they came under attack, classic L-shaped attack, and in fact the Germans had installed machine guns up in platforms, up in the trees, to create total confusion. The guys didn't know where the gunfire was coming from. The men had to withdraw, and in doing so, both Stanley Burrows and another colleague both mentioned that when they withdrew, they had to leave 4 men wounded behind the wall. It turned out that 2 of those men were actually stretcher bearers, and they were attempting to get 2 other wounded out, and they then themselves became casualties, and the thing became impossible. So they had to be left, and they were left behind the wall. At that point in time, on the evening of the 7th of June, one of the guys who was involved in the attack, it was D Company, the 2nd Royal Ulster Rifles, recovered a cuff insignia from the German troops inside, and it was the Hitler Jugend, which was the 12th SS Panzer Division. Hitler Jugend stands for Hitler Youth, but these were not youths, they were not Boy Scouts. You have to look into the National Socialism indoctrination that had been going on in Germany for years. And these were guys who, from they were 10 years of age, were indoctrinated into the Nazi way of life. Scouting groups and church groups had all been dissolved by the Nazi regime, and the only avenue for boys and girls was the Hitler Youth. Once they became fighting age, they were then more or less forced into this newly established Hitler Jugend 12th SS division. There was certainly no, there was no, I don't want to go into that one, I want to go into another one. There was none of that. They were just basically put into it. Their officers and NCOs came from another notorious division, the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, which was Adolf Hitler's bodyguard. And by this stage, by 1943, when the battalion was established, the Leibstandarte already had a horrendous history of war crimes over Eastern Europe, Russia, Poland, and France. So these were the guys that were training these young kids and forming them into a battalion. So we then go down a totally different rabbit hole. The commander of the 12th SS Hitler Jugend was Kurt Meyer, war criminal. He was eventually apprehended by Canadians, and if you remember the boundary I showed you, the Canadians on one side, the British on the other. And he was tried and found guilty for offences relating to the murder in total of some 156 Canadian soldiers in Normandy during the first 4 weeks or so of the war. And actually I read a statistic through the research, and it stated that 1 in 6 Canadian fatalities for those few weeks were men killed in captivity. They'd been prisoners of war and they were executed. And I thought 1 in 6, that's a bit, come on. So I actually crunched the numbers on the Commonwealth War Graves site and put in these figures, and yes, it is correct. So what impact had that on the Ulster Riflemen? Well, Kurt Meyer, during his interview, was shown this map. This is a copy of the original, held at Kew in the National Archives. And prior to his trial, he was sat down and he was asked to account for where his manpower was on the 6th and 7th of June 1944. And this was in relation to the Abbey Dardenne massacres. 18 bodies had been found here in the meantime, once the Germans were repulsed out of this area. And that was his headquarters. So on the map, he indicated in red where 3 battalions of his 25th Panzer Grenadier regiments were. From right to left, the 1st, the 2nd, and the 3rd. These red arced notations on the map. And the little point at each of them, if I can stop my hand shaking, shows you the direction of their proposed advance from the 6th to the 7th of June. So here we have the 1st Battalion, 25th Panzer Grenadiers, commanded by a guy called Hans Waldmüller, Johann Waldmüller. So they were the battalion that occupied Common Plain, or Cam's Woods, as the guys would refer to it as. So that's who we had in there. If the reconnaissance had found that out, they would have known who they were. Unfortunately, they didn't. So they attacked in one company. They were repulsed, and these 4 men were left, and they then became bodies because what happened was when the battalion then attacked again on the 9th of June, they attacked in battalion strength. This is their planning map. This is the village of Annecy, which I pointed to earlier, and this is Combs with the boundary wall and the railway line, which is no longer there today. And the hole in the wall was round about here, which is actually very close to where the Royal Ulster Rifles 2nd Battalion Memorial is today. So the guys attacked in battalion strength. They had support from the East Riding Yeomanry and Sherman tanks, including Firefly tanks. They had also support from naval artillery offshore, and also from Royal Engineers and Royal Artillery. So big attack went in. The village was taken, and Stanley Burrows recalled that afterwards, and I think to put this in context, it was some time, like years afterwards, that Ian Harris, the commander, had spoken to him and told him that the 4 men who had been left were all found with gunshot wound to the head. They'd each been murdered. So a war crime had taken place. Or had it? If Stanley was told by his commander, it's hearsay. So we need corroboration to try and prove that. So I went back to the Ulster Rifles Museum and found a diary that belonged to the guy in the centre of this photograph, quite a famous photograph. Any of you have looked at the history, have probably seen it, and it's basically taken during the liberation of Caen, which the 2nd Battalion had the honour to do. And it shows Lieutenant Cyril Rand here. Cyril Rand's papers over the years were lodged with the Royal Ulster Rifles Museum, and in it there's a diary, and in the diary he states that he went back during the 2nd attack at Caen, and during that attack they found the bodies of the 4 men who had been left behind with the gunshot wound to the head for each of them. So we have a war crime has taken place. Um, there are various records available. There are files at Kew that have only just been released in the last 2 or 3 years, which maybe says something. And in it there is a file relating to Kurt Meyer's trial, large file, and it outlines that an investigation was instigated by the Canadian military authorities, but it had a terms of reference, if you like, and the boundary of their investigation was the blue line that I showed you on the map. So you can see that there was confusion there anyway, and actually the Annecy, from where the Ulster Rifles attacked from, was actually on the, if you like, the Canadian side of the map. So I found a file that indicated that there were a number of murder investigations, if you like, outstanding murders, and that they were handed over to the Canadians to be added to their list of 156 or thereabouts, and it was ruled that due to lack of witness evidence. Now bear in mind, Combs was encircled with a wall, and the only people in there were the 12th SS. 1 or 2 witnesses did come out in the inquiry who had been captured, and they basically turned and gave evidence against their own commanders because of the way they'd been brutally trained. They hated them, but not in relation to what happened at Combs. So I looked then at the Commonwealth War Graves records, and the men were buried more or less where they fell originally, and then they were all moved into the cemeteries that we see today. Like last night, for instance, on the BBC coverage, you see these massive regimented cemeteries. But on the day, they were basically buried in people's gardens, at roadsides, wherever. And eventually they were all exhumed and reburied. So these reports are made for every exhumation. And on the 7th of June, there were 16 men and 1 officer, Captain Allworth, killed at Comm. And all of them, along with all of the others who were then killed in the second attack, in the region of 42 men altogether, they were all buried at Comm on Plain, and then moved to La Deliverance. Now, out of them all, these 4 guys, Rogers, Mullen, Michelides and Valentine, were buried at Cazelle originally. Cazelle was the brigade headquarters location on that day, on the 9th of June, and I believe they were taken there for post-mortem examination and then reburied at La Deliverance because this had been reported. We've heard that Ian Harris, the commander, knew about it through what Stanley Burrows had said. Also, there's a reference number here, and each of them has the same reference number, each of these 4 men, and it starts off with SSP, and then C, which I take to mean is Calvados, which is the region of Normandy that we're in here, NWE, Northwest Europe, and then a reference number. The SSP I couldn't find. There's another guy, he's in the audience today, Michael Jackson. He also has tried to find these files that are referenced here. We've tried Commonwealth War Graves Commission, we've tried Kew, we've tried everywhere, and we can't find them. So it's up to your guess is as good as mine, but SS, fair enough, and P, perhaps prisoner or prisoner of war. So maybe there was some sort of a record of what happened to these guys recorded. But anyway, I believe that these are the 4 men who were actually killed, murdered, if you like, at Common Plain. You can see also that the dates on a couple of them have been changed to the 9th of June, which would have been the day they were discovered. And then the 2 of them here, Valentine and Michelides, have confirmed as being stretcher bearers, which fits with the scenario that played out. So each of the guys interviewed, we spoke about this earlier, they all were perhaps disappointed in how after the war and as the years went on, how they were remembered or weren't remembered, if you like. Bill McConnell and Stanley Burrows, they both pushed to have these memorials put in place. This is the 2nd Battalion Memorial at Common Plain and this is probably near enough where the hole in the wall would have been actually, and you can see the wood behind. So it was eventually installed here in the early 90s, and the other one then for the 1st Battalion was placed at Longueval, which was effectively their frontline position before their attack at St. Honran. And the street, incidentally, that forms the junction here is named the Avenue de Henri Davoisin. And Henri Davoisin, he was a doctor. His house was at the far end of the street, and it was actually used as a headquarters for the 1st Battalion for a period. He was a doctor, but he was also a local Maquis or French resistance commander. And he actually, I believe, brought, when we talk about the 2nd Battalion liberating Caen, but the first Allied soldiers into Caen were actually Bill McConnell and his captain, a guy called Martin, and 3 others who we don't know. And they were taken in the early hours of the 7th of June by this doctor, Henri Davoisin, in the back of a lorry with just like civilian smocks over their uniform. So they were driven into Caen. Captain Martin got out and carried out a reconnaissance of about 20 minutes, during which time Bill McConnell was getting a bit anxious because the place was swarming with Germans. They got back into the lorry and got back out again. And I think that the intelligence I've picked up, there is, when you look at the brigade war diaries, the higher level war diaries, you can see that there was intelligence shared between the 1st and the 2nd Battalions. And it was probably that intelligence that led them to decide not to cycle into France or into Caen and take the city. We're going to do this slowly. The village eventually being liberated, or the city eventually being liberated on the 8th of July. So these are the 2 memorials to these 2 battalions. And my effort, I suppose, is an act in itself of remembrance, and as is you guys being here today. And I'd just like to thank you all for coming. Thank you.